Okay, do you, yeah, wait, starting recording. Okay, do you have a notification that says Youri's recording the call?
Yes, there's something down here in the corner. Let me just
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. So honored to have back on the program, we have Ken Stone, who is an anti-imperialist campaigner who is part of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, Hamilton Coalition to Stop all wars, because Hamilton Coalition is not selectively anti-war, anti-imperialist. They're consistently anti-war, anti-imperialist. So we have Ken Stone. We're going to be talking, mostly about the new yellow peril, the new anti-China derangement syndrome, the new the new Cold War on China. But Ken, Ken, first off, thank you for coming back on the program.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And Ken, before we talk about the really disgusting, reckless, dangerous, stupid, anti-China stories that keeps coming out of the corporate state press in Canada, and all of the political parties without exception jumping on this bandwagon of non-existent Chinese interference in Canada's oligarchic elections. I wanted to talk briefly about two other countries where imperialism is rearing its ugly head. The first one is Syria, and this is why I'm so glad I'm talking to you, because I recently had Rick Sterling on the program and he gave his reflections on the following. So the Western Gulf War on Syria has de facto ended. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE have more or less stopped supporting radical Wahhabi death squads in Syria. Call it Al-Nusra Front, call it ISIS, but they've more or less stopped funding those programs. We don't hear any more junk stories coming out of the white helmets. There's no more talk of the West and the Gulf states supporting non-existent moderate rebels. I think it's safe to say that Syria has remarkably won the war militarily. The only tragic thing is that now it's an economic war. I mean, the West, the U.S., Canada, and its allies still have sanctions, which I call economic terrorism. They're still inflicting that on Syria. But in terms of Syria going the way of Libya, going the way of Afghanistan in the 80s, going the way of Iraq, Syria has more or less won the war militarily. They've been welcomed back into the Arab League, and thanks to Chinese diplomacy, not so much realpolitik, but thanks to the Chinese and their respect for every nation's sovereignty, even if it's nations that they don't particularly like, whatever system is in place. But the Chinese have ended the Cold War, the cold sectarian war between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I think so I just wanted your thoughts on this. And before you answer, I just want to say another thing, that it is incredible that, not since Vietnam, not since the country of Vietnam has a country remarkably overcome imperial aggression led by the West, the U.S., Canada, Britain, France, NATO countries, and also Gulf imperialism when we talk about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. So I wanted your reflections on that. And also, because Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War was one of the few anti-imperialist groups, not just in Canada, but I would say the West, because your organization was one of the few to speak out against the Syria war and to educate people that This is another Afghanistan. This is another Libya. This is another Iraq war. This is another Vietnam war. Again, I have to really applaud what you and the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War have done. So I just wanted your thoughts on all of the remarks I just made.
Can I indulge myself first and make an important announcement? Because I was going to announce.
Go right ahead.
On your show, you would be the first. Our Canada-wide tour for Dimitri Lascaris, which is going to start in London, Ontario, his birthplace, on June 19th. And in Hamilton, it's going to be on Tuesday, June 20th. So you're our kickoff media interview about this particular tour. Dimitri,
I'm very honored to do that.
Dimitri, what he did was he followed in the footsteps of Tamara Lorenz, and he created for himself a self-financed mission of peace to Russia, in which he said he wanted to see, put himself in the, quote, enemy's shoes and see what this war was all about. And
talking about Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia NATO war.
And he went to Russia for a whole month, the month of April. He spoke to students at their international diplomacy school. He presented at their major think tank. He appeared on Russian media. He's met peace activists. He met government officials. He traveled down to Crimea. He wrote articles on his website, which is dimitrilascaris.org, almost every day, and he tweeted several times a day. And he expressed the view that the Russians have about this war. And I think it truly changed his perspective on why the war happened and why the war was, and why he now thinks that the US and NATO are much more responsible for all of the horrible things that are going on in the theater of war in Ukraine than Russia. And in fact, he thinks that Russia, there may be even a legal case for that Russia was acting in accordance with international law when it launched the special military operation. He says, it's debatable one way or another, but in any case, Russia was left no other choice by NATO and the West.
Then, go ahead.
So, graciously, he is giving his time, and he's also waiving any speaking fees to help peace groups from across the country, from coast to coast in Canada, to host him in their various cities. And the name of the tour is called Making Peace with Russia, One Handshake at a Time. And what he's talking about is his citizen diplomacy in Russia and why it was necessary, because the Canadian government refused to pick up the phone and call Russia and ask what it would take to end the conflict. And his position is that that's the role of the peace movement in Canada now. We have to become citizen diplomats in the abdication of the responsibility of the federal government to use its diplomatic corps of several thousand diplomats and tens of thousands more staff for diplomacy, for negotiation, to find a road to peace. So the tour is going to start in London, and then it's going to go to Hamilton, Toronto, then out west to Winnipeg, Regina, Vancouver, Victoria. Then he flies back and he's go to Montreal, and then to Halifax and probably Fredericton. So it's a Canada-wide tour. It's going to last about 2 weeks, and you're the first place that we're launching the announcement. And I hope that this show gets wide coverage.
Well. Now that you mentioned that, I rarely do this, but I feel I need, but I feel I feel I'm obligated to do this. Uh, to the 520 subscribers of One Plus One, and I always look at who my subscribers are, and they are left-leaning folks, but they're people who watch all sorts of programs, including programs I don't agree with on everything and anything with. But I want to say to those 500 and 200 subscribers, and to the people who follow me on Twitter, who I'm going to safely assume also don't agree with all of my editorial positions, but please share widely whatever you watch of One Plus One, the playlist that I have on all things Middle Eastern politics, all things Latin America, all things Eastern Europe, all things the plight of Black people, all things Indigenous people. Please, folks, share widely your content, even if you do get a lot of flack for it. Look, I'm fine with people even criticizing the program and leaving comments as long as they're polite comments. I'm willing to engage with even people who disagree with me. But One Plus One, it's the tagline: inconvenient truth telling and myth busting, and we need to really we need to have serious, sober conversations when it comes to thorny topics like the pivot to Asia, endless NATO expansion and warmongering, and we do need to build a world of compassion, which is what I think socialism is, and we do need to end this ghastly, grotesque system of imperialism, which does us no favors, even if we might have legitimate grievances or concerns when it comes to Russia, China, or even the current government of Syria, the Ba'athist government, coalition Ba'athist government. So that's just a plea for the audience, because sometimes this channel does not get the views I think it deserves. People like you are always very generous with your time, and it just gets under my skin that sometimes the views are only 36 or 40 when it should be at least in the hundreds or 200s. So and I only wish I could be in Canada to see Dimitri in person, doing all these province. And Dimitri's a friend of the program, so open invite to Dimitri to come on the program if he does have the time. And actually, before I ask a follow-up question on what realistically peace even looks like in Ukraine, your thoughts on my remarks about Syria.
Well, again, before we get to Syria, I want to invite your listeners of One to One to the ones who aren't in Canada and can't attend the in-person events, the in-person lectures by Dimitri, to attend the live stream, which will be free. It'll probably be from the very last in-person event of the tour, either Halifax or Fredericton. And so your viewers can watch what Dimitri has to say upon the return of his mission to Russia. So we look forward to having them join us in this tour, one way or another.
Yeah, and I'll also make sure to post. I always do. I'll also make sure to post the links to Hamilton Coalition's website. Send me also the link to your Facebook page, which I don't think I follow on Facebook, and I'll also post a link to the YouTube channel where Brendan, of the host of Unusual Sources. I also will make sure to post that SoundCloud page so that people can tune in, and if they want to attend in person, yes, they can.
Okay, so, thank you very much. We'll send you all that stuff later today because it's all going to roll off today. So about Syria, yes, you're right that it's a David and Goliath struggle. If this were a few thousand years ago, there would be stories being told about Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president who took on the biggest empire that the world has ever seen and defeated it. Someday, maybe there will be stories written in that vein, because it is a miraculous event that the country of Syria managed to survive 12 years of foreign intervention. And now, as you pointed out, the country, the government of Syria is, in a fairly stable position. But there are, contrary to what you said, still terrorist mercenaries that are occupying the northwestern province of Idlib. And they're not supported by the Arab governments anymore. Thankfully, the Arab governments have invited Syria back into the Arab League, to which Syria was a founding member in 1945. Syria has always been a leader in the Arab world. It has always had a pan-Arabist view that all the Arabs should unite together to resist Western imperialism. The fact is that in 19
and I would even say, because I personally don't like even the term pan Arab or pan Middle East or pan Muslim, because there's a sectarian undertone. But Syria may not be perfect all the time, but Syria is very much pan Middle Easternism. There's no room for any kind of sectarianism. Kurds are respected, Christians are respected. Whatever Jewish community does exist there, if they haven't gone to Israel, are respected, which is why many Syrians, those that lived in Syria, were very baffled when they heard all of these junk stories about an Alawite sect genociding Sunnis. But it's like, no, that's simply not true.
Well, you hit on a very important point, and that was one of the reasons that the Syrian government survived. It's because it's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. It's a secular state, but Exactly. It allows freedom of religion. And so all the religious groups and ethnic groups within Syria are guaranteed their ethnic freedom to practice their religions and languages. And so Christians support the Syrian government, and Muslims of all sects support the Syrian government, and they regard Syria as the protector of minorities. So when these terrorist mercenaries were sent in by the U.S. and its NATO allies, and including the Arab governments, which originally were involved in this conflict, the Syrian government received strong support from all of its diverse ethnic communities, and that was one of the secrets of its survival. Now today, in Idlib, as I said, the Turks are still supporting the terrorist mercenaries.
Wow.
They're a branch of Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra, the Syrian franchise. And they have, the Turkish government has told them that they have to leave, but they're not leaving. And that's because the Turkish government hasn't yet made all the preconditions to Syria in order for a peace to be signed, to be negotiated and signed. So there's that one issue in that corner of Syria. Then along the northern border, the Turks have seized a buffer zone over the last few years, and they are using these terrorist mercenaries as their foot soldiers. They also have Turkish troops in this buffer zone, and the reason for this buffer zone is to prevent incursions by the Kurdish separatists who want to establish a separate state in Turkey, in Syria, in Iran, in Iraq, and other countries of the Middle East. And the only reason that these Turks have influence is because the U.S. is using them as a proxy force.
Turkey is a member of NATO, one that does suffer from not schizophrenia, as people often use, but multiple personality disorder. And so yes. Thank you very much for sharing that information. And although I do understand, sorry to interrupt, but I think it's important to mention this. Although I do understand the very, very legitimate grievances of the Kurdish people, whether they're in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and elsewhere. But how can I say this? The project of of a Kurdistan, of a greater Kurdish nation. Many people have been fooled to think that it's a progressive thing, and certainly the right to self-determination does have to be taken into account. And the only way, and that's why I'm a pan-Middle Easternist, not a pan-Arab, a pan-Arabist. But there's a lot of mythology amongst Kurdish nationalism. It's a lot of ethno-nationalism, just like we're going to talk about this later with Ukraine. Just like the Western-backed Ukrainian movement is not a progressive movement, especially if they lionize people like Stepan Bandera, the infamous Nazi collaborator. And a lot of the Kurdish ethno-nationalists, whether it was in Iraq, whether it was in Syria, are not progressive, and one shouldn't confuse the ones in Turkey who are fighting for a better society and would simply like to be respected as Kurds living in the Republic of Turkey. So it's very important to mention that, because a lot of the left getting whatever I think bad information they're getting think that this whole idea of of a Kurdistan is a socialist progressive thing, when it isn't. And if the West is supporting it, then for a fact the West is supporting the most reactionary forces amongst the Kurdish nationalist movements.
Well, exactly. The Kurds are a people who are spread among a number of countries in the Middle East, and some people have said they were the forgotten people in the peace treaty after World War I, when the French and the British sat down with a ruler and a pencil and drew lines on the map of the old Ottoman Empire. And sorry about that.
No problem.
And the French and the British did this to divide up the people of the Middle East, so they could not resist Western imperialism. Now, in the years in between, since 1919 till today, the Kurds have been used a number of times. They've been promised things, first by the British and then by the French, if they would take part in regime change operations against Iran, against Iraq, against Syria. They would get Western backing for a state. And what happened is in Syria is that the Israelis, who are one of the main backers of these Kurdish separatists, because it's also in the interest of Israel
exactly
to fractionalize, to balkanize all of these states and actually destroy them. Not just regime change, but to break up countries like Syria so they can hang on to the Golan Heights, which they seized illegally in a war back in 1967, and they're occupying and colonizing to this day. So what the Israelis want is they want to grab the pieces of all the neighboring countries around them. And in Syria, they have given arms to and support to the Kurds, and precisely for this reason. The Americans have also promised to the Kurds in northern Syria, northeastern Syria, that they would support them towards this greater Kurdish project if they would be their foot soldiers on the ground along the border with Turkey. So we have, and what they, despite their radical rhetoric, these people who call themselves the government,
Anarcho Syndicalists and stuff like that.
What they have actually done is they have stolen land and ethnically cleansed many of the Arab tribes that have lived there for centuries, for millennia, in northern Syria, and they're trying to displace them and replace them with a Kurdish state of their own. This is a war crime under the international law and the United Nations Charter. So despite their anarcho-syndicalist rhetoric, they are actually in the service of empire, the U.S. empire. And the U.S. empire is sitting on Syria's, to this day, sitting on Syria's petroleum resources. And they're doing that for two reasons. One is so that Syria cannot recover and rebuild from this long war that the U.S. has imposed on them. And secondly, they want to, and they've said this, they want to use those petroleum resources as a bargaining chip in the final settlement over the war in Syria. So they want to have, the Americans want to have a voice in who is in the government and what the government looks like post-war Syria. And these issues are still outstanding. And that's why we can't say that the war is over yet.
Yeah, in fact, I had Rania Kalik of Breakthrough News, Unauthorized Disclosure, and you know, and her own program, the Rania Kalik Show, on the call. And I remember when I interviewed her, she's someone whose work I greatly admire and you know and follow very closely. She once did a report back for Alternet before Alternet went full anti-Russia derangement syndrome and full pro-Democrats, even if it wasn't Bernie steering the ship. And she was reporting in Iraq how, you know, the ISIS death squads, when they marched into a part of of Iraq, which was heavily populated by, you know, the Kurds. The Kurds, well, not the Kurds themselves, but the ethno-nationalist leadership of the Kurds. Basically, they were either complicit or basically threw these people called the Yazidis to these ISIS wolves, and one of the most horrific genocides. One of the most horrific genocides, you know, took place, which is why, you know, Rania says that, like, this whole, you know, Kurdistan, greater Kurd project, which some on the left support, is again not a socialist, progressive, or some kind of Spanish Civil War anarcho syndicalist project. So. And then before we get to Ukraine, final thoughts. Any final thoughts on on the fact that Syria, as you mentioned, a lot of the huge battles have been won, but the war is still going on, both economically and with Turkey's proxies. But yeah, any thoughts on just how remarkable it is that that Assad, like Ho Chi Minh of the past, like Fidel Castro, has given a huge black eye to the American, Canadian, Anglo-American, Canadian, pan-European empires and Gulf and Gulf imperialism.
There's no doubt about it, Youri, that Assad's leadership and the leadership of the Ba'athist Party made it alliances. They kept their alliances, and they relied on their alliances to Iran and to Russia and to Hezbollah in Lebanon, plus certain Palestinian factions, armed factions that were loyal to the government of Syria, because Syria has always been the strongest supporter in the Arab world of the Palestinian cause. So
regardless of who's even in power. I mean, when it was led by the secular Fatah of the PLO, the Yasser Arafat, Syria recognized them. When Gaza was democratically, when the Gazans democratically elected Hamas, again, whatever one may think about Hamas, but Syria recognized that this is the legitimate government, and we will work with them to find a just solution to settler colonialism in the occupied territories and Israel, which is why, as you mentioned, Israel, there's sometimes it's too much focus on what Israel does to the Palestinians, which we should never ignore. But Israel is a partner in crime to the Anglo-American, pan-European empires. It supported the dirty war in Libya. It supported the color revolutions of Egypt. Israel supports every single right-wing junta and every single right-wing demagogue in Latin America. Israel supported the coup against Lumumba and supports the Rwandan ethno-nationalist terrorists of Paul Kagame when they ousted Mobutu. So Israel is no friend. Israel is no friend to the international community. It's a partner in crime to the American-led empire.
I couldn't agree more. So I think, and by the way, Israel has bombed Syria 17 times so far this year. Israel is trying to do everything it can so that Syria cannot rebuild, and they are trying to actually open a second front with Syria so that Syria will be fighting not only against the Americans who are occupying the northeast of Syria, but also against Turkey. And the Syrian government is a very patient and determined and disciplined organization, and they are doing their best to shoot down these Israeli missiles and planes, and they're getting better at it actually, and not to be drawn into another front, another war front. What the war in Syria has done is it has helped to change the balance of power in the world, because from 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans became the sole superpower in a unipolar world. But that all changed in September 30th, 2015, when the Russian Air Force came into Syria and they attacked the convoys of ISIS and Al-Qaeda-led trucks that were stealing Syrian oil and taking it to Erdogan's brother-in-law in Turkey. And that was the end of the unipolar world. And that was the beginning of a multipolar world. So the fact that Russia and Syria remain friends and allies and work together along with Iran and Hezbollah and these Palestinian militias to defeat the regime change war has changed the world. It has made a change that has been amplified by Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, and by the fact that the Russians and the Chinese and now the BRICS have taken the side of Russia, more or less, in defending Russia against the economic war that the West has tried to lever against Russia as in response to the special military operation. So it's all part of a change in the balance of power in the world. That's how Syria plays into it.
And that's a perfect segue. We're not going to talk too much about Ukraine, but I do have to ask this question about Ukraine, which is the following. Now, I'm one of those anti-imperialist leftists which understands why Russia felt it had no other choice but to use the military option. Although I don't like the fact that Russia does their military operations, because in my opinion, and these are just facts, I think it's only further inflamed pro-NATO attitudes. I think it's only further inflamed the Ukrainian, mostly Western Ukrainian movement, but even some in Eastern Ukraine who believe, who believe that joining NATO is much better for them as opposed to just peaceful relations with Russia, whatever legitimate grievances, historical legitimate grievances they may have with Russia. So, and I can say, living in Belgium, belly of the beast, for those who support, ending the European Union, for those who really hate NATO, I'm really in the belly of the beast, and you cannot have any kind of rational discussion on just presenting, not just even presenting, the Russian point of view, but you just cannot have a rational conversation about how it's NATO which is in the wrong. Yes, we would love a united Ukraine, but it's NATO and Western meddling in Ukraine that led to, pardon my language, this cluster of a situation. But that being said, now that Russia has done its military actions, and the West did sabotage the Minsk Accords. They never took seriously any of the kind of diplomacy that that Russia was trying to engage with with the West in. So all that being said, when it comes to what does realistically peace look like, my colleague and friend Boyan Stanislavski of The Barricade, which is a pan-Eastern European left-wing news outlet, Boyan has said many times on his program and the last show we did during the Christmas holidays, Boyan says that he thinks this is what's going to happen with Ukraine. It'll be 3 partitioned countries, or even 2 partitioned countries, where Western Ukraine, with Kiev as its capital, that will be Ukraine, which will be aligned, unfortunately, with NATO, the European Union, and the collective West. Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, Donetsk will either be an independent country, which will be recognized by Russia and much of the international community, which takes the side of, even if we don't like what Russia did, Russia's in the right and the West is completely in the wrong. And then Luhansk will also be either an independent country, or both of those places will simply, like Crimea, join the Russian Federation. I think that's very sad, but that just but again, if that is what's going to happen, I know who I'm blaming, and it's and it's Western meddling in Ukraine that led to this tragedy, where even amongst Ukrainians, those who intermarry of a Ukrainian background and those of a Ukrainian background but speak Russian and whatnot, that people are divorcing, people aren't talking to each other, people there's that Cold War. That tragedy, though, again, I blame Western imperialism for that. So I want your thoughts on on that possibility of Ukraine being partitioned into 2 or 3 countries.
Well, Youri, unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball, and Mr. Putin hasn't called me up in the last few weeks. So I don't know what the plans are from here on. I can see that the Russian position is hardening. They did offer a peace deal. And Dimitri Lascaris, who went there, found after 4 days in Moscow, he had the peace deal that Trudeau and Madame Joly could not find out after 15 months, because they never bothered to pick up the phone or use their consular officials to find out what it would take to end the conflict. And with the peace deal was basically Russia keeps those 4 provinces that they announced they had become part of Russia, and the war ends when Ukraine says that it will never join NATO, it will demilitarize, it will become a neutral country, which was part of the Constitution of 1991 of Ukraine when it became independent, and it will denazify. So we could have peace today if the West accepted that. And the Chinese came in with a proposal that was similar to that, but the West said, no, we're not interested at this point in talking about that, because they are planning this Ukrainian counteroffensive to try and liberate from Russia those 4 places that they have annexed. So the Russian position is hardening, and now, if they have to fight a NATO-backed Ukrainian offensive this summer or this fall or whenever it takes place, with all the British tanks and now the F-16s and all these other things, and it doesn't spiral into the Third World War and we're all breathing radioactive waste.
Well, they're even using depleted uranium. The Ukrainian-backed forces are even using depleted uranium.
Or the Russians blew that up. They blew it up at a place near, I can't remember how to pronounce that place, but it was near Lvov, and it was about 2 weeks ago. They waited until all the British tanks with their depleted uranium shells arrived and were stored in one spot. They waited until the wind was blowing from the east, and then they sent one of their fast missiles and blew it up. It was a column that went up 20 kilometers into the sky. It actually formed a mushroom cloud, and then it blew west over Poland and over Germany. And when it blew over Germany, the German scientists were using Geiger counters, and they said it registered 200 times normal. The cloud was 15 kilometers wide, and the radioactivity was 200 times the normal level, and it was continuing westward towards Britain, where hopefully it will fall, because it's the Brits who caused this problem. But the Russians, as I had predicted earlier, not on your show, would not tolerate depleted uranium munitions to be used against the Russian people and the Russian motherland. And that's what happened. You can look it up. It's a fact. It happened about 2 weeks ago, and there's no more depleted uranium munitions from Britain in Ukraine.
Well, that's a perfect, well, hopefully cooler heads will prevail and this monstrous war ends, and hopefully, I don't think the politicians are going to do this, but hopefully Ukrainians from both sides of the aisle, Western Ukrainians and Eastern Ukrainians, hopefully they have to be the ones to start, making peace and true reconciliation within itself, because I simply don't trust Mr. War Profiteer Joe Biden and Mrs. Hysteria Friedland, as she used to be called amongst her junk journalism colleagues. I don't expect them to be the ones to be the voices of reasons of trying to even reconcile, not just Ukrainians, but even Ukrainians and Russians with each other. And that's, which is why I often say, power to the people, but death to Western imperialism.
Well, we have to understand, Youri, that the reason that the U.S. and NATO are in Ukraine is because they have hegemonic ambitions. Hegemony is a fancy political economy term for domination. Their plan is to dominate the planet. They would love very much to do to the Russian Federation what they did to the Yugoslavian Federation in 1990.
Exactly.
Chop it all up and then gobble it up. There are many resources that they want in Russia, and they know that they can't get them with strong Russian Federation. They can't seize them. They would have to trade. God forbid they should trade. And so their plan is to destroy the Russian Federation and then move on to China and break it up into many pieces and seize it as well. So
and that is a perfect segue for China, which is what I wanted to talk to you about, and the pivot to Asia. Now, oh my God, it has been horrific watching Canadian news. It's been horrific, reading not even just the articles, but just the headlines and the thesis of our friend Aidan Jonah and his team at the Canada Files, who have been covering this fake scandal of Chinese interference in the last Canadian election. And we see politicians. So actually, explain to people outside of Canada who have not been following this what this whole ridiculous soap opera has been going on, with Chinese meddling in Canadian elections. And then after you explain that, I'll ask an important follow-up question. So
okay, well, you have to remember first of all that Canada and China had very good relations from 1971, I think it was, until 2018. In 1971, Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, who had a lot more balls and sense than his son.
Which is not saying a lot because I have my criticism, of Pierre Trudeau, but that's another topic for another day.
Right. But what he did, to his credit, he had something of an independent foreign policy for Canada. And he said, I'm going to recognize the People's Republic of China, and we're going to open trade with them because it's going to be a win-win situation. And so Trudeau recognized China's one China policy, that Taiwan is actually a province of China, and there's only one government that we recognize, and that's the government in Beijing. And so for 50 years, almost 50 years, 5 decades, Canada and China traded and had good diplomatic relations. It was a win-win situation. Canadian farmers and fishermen and producers of all kinds sold all kinds of stuff to China. It created prosperity for many people in Canada. Not everybody, of course, because in Canada it's a class society. Some people profited more than others, but still, it was a good relationship until Trudeau succumbed to Donald Trump and Bolton, and Trump wanted to use Meng Wanzhou as a bargaining chip in his trade war with China. So he persuaded
the CFO or CEO of Huawei.
Right, and the U.S. Special Select Committee on Security, I think it's called, Senators Rubio and Wagner sent a letter to Trudeau 6 weeks before Meng Wanzhou was picked up at Vancouver Airport, and they said, you must get rid of Huawei in the rollout of Canada's 5G technology because it's bad for American business. And so, Trudeau, the younger, was not like Trudeau, the elder. He has no independence of foreign policy. He is a complete vassal of whoever is sitting in the White House or the State Department. And Trump told him, Meng Wanzhou was traveling through 30 countries. They could not get a single other country to arrest her but Canada. And Trudeau arrested her. And since then, our relations with China have gone further and further downhill. The latest thing is this Chinese alleged interference in Canadian elections. Well, this is a joke because the Chinese couldn't care less about Canadian elections. They are interested in Canadian trade. They, as a rule, do not meddle in the internal affairs of other countries. But there are other countries that meddle routinely in the internal affairs of this country, Canada, where I'm sitting today. And those are the United States of America, the Israeli government, and our other four eyes of the Five Eyes intelligence partners. The Five Eyes intelligence.
And not only that, but the head of state of Canada is formerly the Queen of England. Now it's the King of England, Jay Watts, my friend Jay Watts, formerly of the Communist Party of Canada. I mean, that's the head of state with their with the Privy Council that can override laws, with the unelected Senate, which is the Canadian version of what the unelected House of Lords is, similar to in Australia and New Zealand. And people are worried about non-existent Chinese Russian interference when Canada's own head of state is the King of England.
You're absolutely right, Youri. So
I mean, yeah.
We have to remember as well that Canada has a very racist history. When the railway was being built in the early 1880s, they could not find laborers who would do these dangerous and dirty jobs at low pay and with hardly any food. And so they imported at least 25,000 Chinese laborers from China to come and work on the railway. And according to a conservative estimate, 10,000 of them died working on the railway. 10,000, that's 40% employee death rate. And then Canada in the early 20th century decided it didn't want any more Chinese to come to Canada, and they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923, exactly 100 years ago, and they imposed a head tax on Chinese. All the Chinese had to register who were in Canada, and any ones, and they all had to pay a head tax. I think all the new immigrants.
And what exactly? And actually, explain that. What exactly is that? A head tax?
Yeah, you have. If you wanted to come from China, this is how I understand it, and become an immigrant to Canada, you would have to pay a head tax of $500. It doesn't sound like much today, but it's the equivalent of $50,000 today. And so it was a way to discourage Chinese immigration to Canada. And this is part and parcel of our history, the racist history of Canada. And so when this scandal, this fake scandal, a fake scandal appeared a few months ago because CSIS started leaking information to the Globe and Mail, to two journalists at the Globe and Mail, that Canada had been interfering in the 1919 and 1920, the 2019 and 2021 election campaigns. All this racist hysteria started up again, and certain Chinese politicians, Chinese Canadian politicians in Canada, were immediately held as suspect, as agents of China, and their careers were destroyed. One of them, I think, or maybe two now, are suing the Globe and Mail and Global News for suggesting that they were acting as agents of China. And on that, there's been talk about Chinese police stations in Canada. Well, what these Chinese police stations in Canada turn out to be are Chinese cultural
diaspora folks, yeah.
In particularly two of them in Montreal that have existed for decades. And they are for the Chinese Canadian community to be able to integrate into Canadian society. There's no Chinese political officers that work out of this. These are Canadian, local, grassroots community organizations to help people of Chinese origin to get integrated into Canadian society. And when these attacks were launched in the media, that these were Chinese police stations, they held public meetings and demanded that this attack stop because it's a racist attack. But I think what's going to happen is probably their government subsidies will be pulled, and these Chinese Canadian community associations will probably die, because without the help of municipal, provincial, and federal governments, they'll probably won't have the money to keep the lights on.
And then another thing that's been going on, and I personally find this the most sickening element of the of this BS Chinese interference story, is you have Canadian politicians. So you have those who have been slandered as Chinese agents in the back pocket of Chinese businessmen, or the CPC, the Communist Party of China. So you have those false accusations, but then you have a conservative MP, Michael Chung, who's he's Canadian. He is of Chinese descent, but he's definitely one of those immigrants who fully assimilated into Canada, into his adopted home. So I don't know if he even speaks Chinese, but he has been saying he has been saying things like, the Chinese government has been targeting me and my family in Canada, and they've been targeting our family back in Hong Kong. I demand that the Liberal government be more transparent and tell me, what are they hiding? And then you have this NDP MP, also of a
Nancy Kwan,
also of a Chinese background, who's also been saying that she's been targeted by China's network of spies. And what they are doing, again, which I find so sickening, is they're engaging in this model minority myth. I'm a good Chinese Canadian because I speak out and I recycle junk about China, that they're a rival, that they're an economic rival to my government. China's engaging in settler colonialism in Tibet and amongst the Uyghur people, and the Chinese are being brutal against the Hong Kong independence movement. And I'll just briefly say, the Uyghur separatist movement is not a progressive project. The Hong Kong independence movement is not a progressive socialist, not even a liberal project. It's a reactionary, uber-capitalist, ethno-nationalist project. And then, we talked last time. You were pushing back against, against my, sort of soft support of Taiwanese independence, and why can't Taiwan just have an independence, whether they want to be independent or part of China? Well, even if people believe that Taiwan deserves independence, they have to really, 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 really dig deep into what that means, because my comrade, Fiona, of a Chinese background based in England, they were telling me that, well, you need to look more into what that means. And Fiona explained to me that Taiwanese independence means this: those who fled the civil war, which the communists won, those led by Chiang Kai-shek, they think of themselves as a government in exile, and they don't just want independence from Taiwan. They would actually love a huge revolution, a huge regime change where they get to be in the driver's seat, and that, for them, is good relations with the Five Eyes Alliance and the collective West. So even if folks believe in Taiwanese independence, I can tell you the imperialist, capitalist governments that be are supporting the most reactionary movements, like they always do, wherever imperialism wants to reign its ugly head. Your response to that?
The movements you referred to, Uyghur independence, Taiwanese independence, Hong Kong independence, Tibetan independence, these are all manifestations of Western foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, Canadian foreign policy, CIA funded by George Soros and the National Endowment for Democracy. These are foreign created movements to undermine the People's Republic of China, and it's part of a worldwide attempt by the U.S. for hegemony, to dominate the world. These people, these organizations are part of what Noam Chomsky calls manufacturing consent. And what they're doing right now with this political interference scare and all these other, what do they call them? AstroTurfed, not grassroots. These are AstroTurf, fake foreign created movements to undermine China. These are part of a growing Cold War against China, and probably a hot war that the U.S. is already talking about over Taiwan as early as 2025. That's 2 years from now. The head of the U.S. Marines was, he publicly said, we are practicing now. We are getting ready for an assault, a military intervention into Taiwan in 2025. So it's all part of a big picture. And this political interference scheme is part of that. It's part of the xenophobia that's required, the hatred that they're trying to build up, the suspicion about Chinese Canadians that they're trying to build up inside of Canada. And of course, it's going to end up causing a lot of hate crimes and physical attacks on anybody who looks Chinese in Canada. But
in fact, the comrade I mentioned, Fiona, who's been on the program twice before, they themselves were a victim of a xenophobic hate crime in Britain, in which only in which only the anti-racist movement and the anti-imperialist movement, which is focusing on stopping the pivot to Asia, have been the ones to help. Fiona and the family were completely thrown under the bus by the local government there. But that's a good segue to this question, which is actually, before I talk about how we mobilize against this, it's also important to mention when we talk about this BS Chinese interference story, was that the Chinese Canadian community at a grassroots level, but even those in the business community, those who are part of the working class community, they were very distressed by the anti-China derangement syndrome, which was already happening with the unjust jailing of Meng Wanzhou, and because so much of the left has imperial blind spots, and also I think it goes deeper, xenophobic blind spots, this community in Canada mobilized themselves to say, please vote for this candidate who wants better relations with China. Vote for this candidate who's not on board with a new Cold War with China. And a lot of those politicians, mostly of the Conservative Party, lost in their riding. Then the Conservative Party, led by that douchebag Aaron O'Toole and the current crook that's in power, Pierre Poilievre, what they've been doing is they've been attacking the ruling Liberal Party, which is a center-right party. It's a rival oligarchic party. It's a rival settler colonialist party. The Liberal Party, these are the people who claim that they're, compassionate conservatives, progressive conservatives. There used to be a party called the Progressive Conservative, funny enough, in Canada. But they've been saying that the Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau is too soft on China, and that the Liberal Party is in the back pocket of the Chinese state and Chinese businesses, and therefore, Justin Trudeau has been too soft on China. It's been very distressing to see but at the same time, no surprise that the NDP and the Green Party, with that ghastly one-woman show, Elizabeth May, have been attacking the Liberal Party from the right. There's the more reactionary right-wing faction of the Liberal Party, which has been attacking Justin Trudeau from the right. And I find it very scary because, China's a nuclear-armed country, and this could escalate very much, just like what's happening in Ukraine, to not a planned nuclear annihilation, but an accidental nuclear annihilation. And with climate change, heaven forbid, bigger earthquakes or the sea levels get rising, it's not that we're all going to die from drowning and whatnot. It's all of those nuclear weapons are going to explode. And this is why I just cannot understand. I don't even want to get inside the mentality of those on the left, soft left, and even the far left who think that we should be having a war on China. But that leads to this question I wanted to ask you, which is how we mobilize the anti-imperialist movement, whether it's from the left or the right or everything in between. And so I want you to respond to this, because there are some on the left who foolishly believe the Chinese have been interfering. There are some on the left, well-meaning folks who want an end to settler colonialism in Canada, and they think that China is a rival capitalist country, and that China's growing influence in Africa means that they're a rival colonial country, and that when we hear stories of Tibetan Buddhists being discriminated against, a cultural genocide, or the Uyghurs suffer from institutional Islamophobia, there are folks who literally believe that China also practices Islamophobia and settler colonialism, and that, so what if Meng Wanzhou gets arrested? She's a Chinese capitalist, and I may not like my capitalist government, but if I have to choose lesser evilism, I'm going to go for Team Canada, Team Britain, Team Five Eyes Alliance over China. And I want your response to that, and debunk and debunk that argument that some on the left have when it comes to their attitudes towards China.
Well, I think there's a lot of problems with the left in the West not understanding what socialism is. And socialism means the ownership and control of the means of production by the working class. Now, in China, they have taken taken this to heart. At first, they were very rigorous about that the Chinese government had to own each and every piece of the means of production, down to local restaurants. And so there was a change in the 1980s, 1990s, and the Chinese government says, we are going to control the heights of the economy. We are going to control the basic means of production, things that are really important, like manufacturing, mining, transportation, and education, and of course, public sector, the medical system, and we have the control of the police and the army. So we can allow foreign capitalists to buy small shares or up to 48-49% of certain industries to kickstart our industries. And we can allow, local entrepreneurs to set up restaurants and, build.
And they're not obligated to even join the Communist Party of China.
That's right. But overall, where it counts, control of transportation, communication, manufacturing, and all farming, and all these things, the Chinese government has control, and it is a communist party, and it is committed to the welfare of the Chinese people. During the last 5-year plan, they raised 800 million people out of poverty, an achievement unparalleled in human history. So I consider China a socialist country. And I don't see China being an imperialist country, going into other countries around the world with an international monetary fund saying, we'll lend you money, you just have to privatize
your education, privatize your railways, privatize your water.
Else. They don't do that. They go in there and they say to the country, well, we're interested, for example, in your bauxite. But there's no way to get that bauxite to the harbor in your country. So we're going to build you a railway, and we're going to build you the harbor. And when we're finished, we're going to hand you the keys to both of those. And we're going to ask you to sign an agreement that we can exploit the bauxite. That's how China does it. It's not how the Americans or the Canadians or the British or any of the other imperialists do it. And they don't tie the countries into long-term debt that they can't pay. The Chinese often forgive the loans to countries that are suffering. And they have a great reputation in the global south because they have past practice of doing this for decades, whereas the West keeps the global south in slavery, in economic slavery, and exploits their resources for almost nothing and turns the people into slaves. Very brutal. And so the Chinese have even gone further with their Belt and Road Initiative, where they plan to create a new Silk Road. And all along the way, they are benefiting every country that joins the Belt and Road Initiative by building them the infrastructure they could not build themselves. For an example, in Pakistan, they built an entirely new port and railway to that port, which is creating thousands of jobs and prosperity in Pakistan. So, Western leftists have to open their eyes and say, China is a socialist country. It does allow, capitalism around the edges, and that has caused problems. And now the Chinese are saying, yeah, we got to watch that because there is a certain amount of corruption that's been engendered because we let the capitalists come in. But we're going to fix that. And so we should be wary when the West tells us that China is an aggressive enemy, as NATO says, a threat to the West.
But how do you respond to to the argument that China practices settler colonialism in Tibet, that China practices institutional Islamophobia against the Uyghur people. How do you respond to those two to those two things? And are there any half-truths to those allegations? Because that's always the most difficult propaganda. The most difficult propaganda to debunk is when there's a half-truth. So, for example, is Putin a fiscal conservative and social conservative? Yes. But is Navalny a pro-LGBT, feminist, liberal, or left-wing alternative to Putin? No. and does China suppress Uyghur separatist movements? I would say yes, but I would say that they are responding to very real terrorist threats from a faction of Uyghurs who are being supported by yours truly, Turkey, and maybe not so much Saudi Arabia anymore because Saudi Arabia might be joining BRICS, and China brokered peace talks between them and Iran. So are there any half-truths to the allegations that China practices settler colonialism and institutional Islamophobia?
No. These are lies that are peddled in the West. In Xinjiang province, the government of China has created an autonomous republic, an autonomous state, and it has all kinds of guarantees for the language, the culture, and the religion of Uyghurs. The Uyghurs, there's something like 25,000 mosques in Xinjiang province, and some of the biggest mosques in the world are there. There's a lot more mosques in Xinjiang province than all of the United States and Canada put together. And the people of Xinjiang have complete religious freedom, and they have done extremely well. If you look at the birth numbers, the population of Uyghurs has exploded since 1949. They have been treated very well. Then
they were even excluded from the one child policy, which recently China themselves has also repealed. That's
right. And so the Uyghurs are prospering. That's all we could say about that. As for Tibet, when it was liberated by the Chinese, it was liberated through the hands of the Tibetan serfs, because they were fed up with being chattel property of the Tibetan landlords, who treated them less gently than worms. Literally, they were abused and beaten and sold and raped and every other thing that you can think of. And Tibet has been a part of China for at least 500 years. And now, and under Chiang Kai-shek, there was no attempt by the West to break Tibet apart from China and create a separate government. Rather, this was something done through the Dalai Lama, who was and still is on the payroll of the CIA. This was another Western attempt to undermine socialism in China, and that's how Western leaders should treat it. Western leftists should treat it, and well, Western leaders too. We would not like it if Moscow came into Quebec and decided to arm something like the FLQ. We would not like it,
or the Wexit movement, which is
yeah, exactly. So why do we do these things to other countries? It's not the Chinese doing this to Canada. They're not trying to steal Vancouver Island from us. They're not sailing their ships down the Georgia Strait, but we're sailing our ships through the Straits of Taiwan, and we are threatening and encouraging. We are threatening China, and we are encouraging an independence movement that we created in Taiwan to join the World Health Organization. That was something that Judy Sgro told them to do when she went. She is the Canadian Minister of Foreign Trade. After Nancy Pelosi went, Judy Sgro went, and she said, why don't you join the WHO? WHO, and you become, like a country. And they did it. So every time the West interferes in Taiwan, it is to create a problem. It's to create more an independence movement from China, despite the fact that Pierre Trudeau signed on the dotted line that Canada recognizes a one China policy with Beijing as the national government, and Taiwan is a province of China. So really, people just have to open their eyes and remember the big picture, that for 100 years, China was divided up and, in quotations, humiliated for 100 years by Western powers, and they have never forgotten that, and they are not going to let it happen again. So if the Marines decide to come in 2025 to Taiwan and to create a military intervention there, in order to separate Taiwan from China, yes, there will be a war, and yes, your children might die because there might be a nuclear war. So stop falling for this BS and just keep your hands off China. Focus on good relations, the kind of good relations we had for 50 years that made China into our second largest trading partner and caused created a lot of prosperity in Canada. Focus on that. Now, David, your friend and mine, Eve Engler, did a show the other day about David Johnston's report. David Johnston is Justin Trudeau's special rapporteur on Chinese interference. And he poured cold water, in Eve's language, in Eve's own words, on this Chinese interference scare. And he said, this is not a whistleblower from CSIS. These are CSIS operatives leaking top secret information to a newspaper without any control or any repercussion. Nobody has been arrested for doing this. This is an illegal activity. CSIS is breaking its own rules by interfering in the Canadian political process. It's not China.
But also,
wait one second. I think this someone else has pointed this out. The CSIS did this in the 2005 election, I think it was. They played a game by leaking information to the Conservative Party under Stephen Harper, and they used this to bring down the Liberals and bring in Stephen Harper. And we know how much fun that was for about 11 years. So, in my opinion, CSIS is playing a game with the Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre and there were unfortunately the NDP is trying to be more anti-China than the Conservatives right now. But the fact is that this is a dirty game, and if the people who are leaking the information, according to David Johnson, their information they're leaking is, number one, wrong, and number two, taken out of context. So people's careers are being ruined, and people are being whipped up. Canadian sentiments, anti-Chinese sentiments, are being whipped up by lies that are being leaked by somebody who's not authorized to do so from CSIS.
It's also important to. I think it's also important to say the following. First about the Chinese system. Yeah, well, I'll respond to what you just said. When those who are supportive of the of the NDP, I just want to say to them, how can you guys believe CSIS? CSIS are professional liars. This is the Canadian version of MI6, MI5, GCHQ. They're Australian and New Zealand counterparts, and this is Canada's version of the NSA and CIA. Ergo, these are professional liars. How can you guys, believe this? Even if you think that this is the way to unseat Justin Trudeau. And look, I don't like Justin Trudeau. I don't like the Liberal Party. I don't like the Conservative Party. Heck, I don't even like the leadership of the NDP. But this is not a way to go about democracy. Democracy, whether it's a utopian social democracy, liberal democracy, or a revolutionary socialist one, which I would like. But I also want to respond to people who keep talking about Chinese human rights abuses towards Tibetans, Chinese human rights abuses towards Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and people who say that they're afraid that if Taiwan was to ever become part of China again, that there's going to be brutal suppression and so forth. I would just want to say the following: Chinese history is a history where it has been very bloody. There has been lots of upheavals, and there's been a lot of terrible stuff that did happen before Mao Zedong got into power, when Mao Zedong got into power, and even after Mao Zedong got into power. But I think it's very important to say the following: when there was human rights abuses that happened under Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution and during the Great Leap Forward before that, the Chinese system itself recognized that horrendous, pardon my language, horrendous shit happened, which was why the Chinese courts and the Chinese people themselves brought on trial the people known as the Gang of Four, which even included Mao Zedong's own wife, and they held them accountable for whatever crimes against humanity they practiced and their followers practiced. And the Chinese government themselves said that, okay, we need to put a lid on the Chinese Communist Youth League for all of the excesses they did during the Cultural Revolution. I'm saying this because China does hold themselves to account when horrible stuff happens. And even when we talk about the Tiananmen Square massacre, which even I have had to radically decolonize what I used to think about the Tiananmen Square massacre, but that's another topic for another day. But I just want to say to people that even under Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese system brought into account Chinese military and Chinese police that overstepped their boundaries when it came to suppressing, which was, in the end of the day, a mostly Western-backed attempt at a counter-revolution, like what happened with the ends of the Warsaw Pact and the USSR and so forth. So, folks, the Chinese do not need your Western savior complex. They do not need your inner white person's burden syndrome. The Chinese are fine dealing with their own internal problems and their own internal and their own, contradictions and whatever institutional racism that may or may not even exist in the country. But then going forward, I think it's safe to say we can sort of wrap up the show. Is how are we going to mobilize the left? Because it's bad enough that we're, as my friend and frequent guest on this program, Alfred Zaya, says, it's bad enough that we're swimming in an ocean of lies, from fake education to fake history to junk journalism, and we are mostly led by several factions of a right-wingism, whether it's the Conservative Party, whether it's the Liberal Party, whether it's the NDP leadership, I completely exclude the NDP Socialist Caucus and their efforts at building a just world and their anti-imperialism. And then we have the Green Party. How can we mobilize the anti-war, Okay, starting recording. Okay, we're back. Do you got a notification that says I'm recording?
I think so, because there's a button here to press for stop recording.
Okay, and it says that Youri's recording the call.
Yes, it does at the top.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, hello, folks. Welcome back to 1+1. We're just wrapping up my conversation with Ken Stone of Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War about how we mobilize against the pivot to Asia and the rise of xenophobia. So, Ken, I don't know how much you heard from my last question, but basically, in a nutshell, I just wanted to say, how do we mobilize an anti-war, anti-imperialist movement which does get suckered in by junk journalism, by by NGOs that are recycling all this garbage about China being our enemy and all that stuff. How do we mobilize that? And I just wanted to say that, folks, also go back into history and know that when the Vietnam War was happening, there were lots of anti-communist leftists that weren't fans of Ho Chi Minh, but simply, realized that the war in Vietnam was a colonial war, it was an unjust war, and that the Vietnamese themselves had the right to self-determination under whatever government. And one doesn't have to like the USSR, one doesn't have to like Russia under Yeltsin or Russia under Putin, but we just have to know that imperialism is wrong. And when we allow ourselves to be emotionally blackmailed and carrying water for the imperialists, people just have to know that when the imperialists get their way and when we carry water for them, whether it's Libya under Gaddafi, Iraq before Saddam Hussein got into power and when he was in power, or the efforts to try to oust Assad in Syria, or what happened in yours truly, Ukraine, with Viktor Yanukovych, yes, one does not have to like any of those governments, but imperialism is wrong, and it is, as Vladimir Lenin said, it's the highest stage of capitalism, and when we act as chumps for the powers to be, the only thing that happens is a downward spiral of evil stuff, which our imperialist governments do. So I just want your response on how we mobilize the anti-war, anti-imperialist left, and maybe even a few libertarians, the Ron Pauls of the world, that to not fall for the latest weapons of mass deception that's being inflicted on us.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, because it is an important question for the anti-war movement in Canada and in other countries in the imperial West, and that is that we should not fall into supporting the imperialist system and their schemes to take over the world. And so in Canada, for example, I think while there's no shortcut to achieving a bigger anti-war movement, and whereas it's not going to come from any of the parliamentary parties because they've all sold out to the system, every one of them, NDP and Greens included. So we have to start at the base and start with some simple principles like Canada should have an independent foreign policy outside of NATO. Canada should not be supporting military interventions by the US in other countries. And if we would just focus on those couple of things, it becomes very clear that when they're gearing up for a war against Russia over Ukraine or against China over Taiwan, that the people in the street should understand you don't have to like the government of the Russian Federation. You don't have to like the government of the People's Republic of China. Just be respectful and say, let's keep our hands off those, and let's organize to prevent Canada from being drawn into these wars of the empire. Let's get Canada out of NATO. I think if we just focus on those 2 or 3 simple points, we can unite all the people that you were talking about. The people who on the left of the NDP who can't stand the NDP anymore, people who are libertarians, people who are environmentalists because these wars
disillusioned Greens who are upset that it's not a Dimitri Lascaris or a Miriam Haddad or an Alex Tyrell in power.
Right. I think we need just a few basic agreements on Canada out of NATO, no more an independent foreign policy, not to be drawn into any foreign wars. That would be enough to build a bigger, a broader peace or anti-war movement in this country. And so that's my answer to that general question. There's no shortcut to it. It means leafleting. It means holding meetings. It means holding rallies. It means organizing tours for people like Dimitri Lascaris, who, as a citizen journalist, citizen diplomat and journalist, went to Russia to observe what's happening there in the war in Ukraine, because the Canadian government refuses to employ its civil servants, its diplomatic corps, for what they're supposed to do. They're not supposed to go to dinner parties and cocktail parties. They're supposed to bring about negotiations to end wars. And the Canadian government is not doing that. Dimitri went there, and now he's come back to tell Canadians what's really going on in Ukraine, stuff that they cannot read in the mainstream media. And that's why
or even in left media, or even in nonprofit left-leaning media, which is supposed to be independent.
Well, Dimitri is quite broadly published, actually, in the alternate media in Canada. And people can, he also has a website, DimitriLascaris.org, where people can read him in his own writing. And I encourage people to look out for our Dimitri Lascaris tour. It's called Making Peace with Russia, One Handshake at a Time. And it's coming up, starts in June 19th in London and goes to the West Coast and then to the East Coast. And there's going to be some place close to you. And even if you can't, even if there isn't a place close to you, we are going to live stream one of the last stops on the tour so everybody can watch it for free.
And I just want to say, I try not to get too personal doing 1+1, but I just also want to, I want to dedicate this program to two groups of people. Number one, I want to dedicate this program to those in the Chinese community, either in mainland China, in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and those, I want to dedicate this program to them because I have been very impressed and inspired by the fact that that much of the Chinese diaspora, whether it's in Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and America, they've been the ones that have been leading this mobilization effort to stop the pivot to Asia and demand no war to China, and have been really refusing to be this model minority of and refusing to engage in this neo-McCarthyism. So this program is dedicated to them, and a big shout out to my dear friend Fiona, and people, if they want to donate to her, to their efforts at rebuilding their hostel, which got bombed. They were the victims of a Sinophobic hate crime. They can do that. And then also, there's been a growing rise in transphobia and queerphobia. So I do want to say, and there are some, unfortunately, on the left that have also been engaged on that. And I just want to say solidarity to the 2S LGBTQIA community, power to the people, death to heteronormativity, and yes to queer liberation, no to rainbow capitalism. And folks, even if you are transphobic, should check out this book, Trans Resistance, Transgender Resistance, Socialism, and the Fight for Trans Liberation, done by a trans woman, leftist, Laura Miles. And folks, because Pride Month is coming up, should check out this book, Queer Progress from Homophobia to Homo Nationalism by Tim McCaskill. And those in the community, please also do not get suckered into the imperial lies. And folks should also check out this book, Seeing Gender. And then just before we close, I also want to dedicate this particular episode to those involved in the anti-NATO movement, but especially those who were involved in the anti-Syria war movement. It was not easy for anyone to have spoken the truth and to have engaged in myth busting. So to Rick Sterling, Dr. Mara Osman, Rania Khalek, Max Blumenthal, and Aaron Mate of the Gray Zone, Ken Stone and the team at Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. Thank you guys for sticking your necks out and saying hands off Syria, and also shout out to those at Minpress News, Eva Bartlett, Vanessa Beeley, Whitney Webb, Manar Adley, and so forth. And Ken, any other closing remarks? Remind people again, Dimitri Lascaris's peace tour. Right.
People can come to the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War website in about a day. We're just launching the thing today or tomorrow. You're the first show, Youri, and we're very pleased to be on it. And we are going to have a tour by Dimitri Lascaris. It'll be on Facebook. It'll be on Twitter. It is a tour that has been authorized by the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, and it'll be on the website of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network as well. It starts June 19th. We are charging token admission for security reasons, but there will be a free live stream at the end for everybody to participate in.
And I will make sure to upload this episode and to merge the two parts very quickly. And yes, and so we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with the brilliant Ken Stone, a founding member of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War and the Syria Solidarity Movement. Ken, thank you so much for taking the time off of your Friday morning, to come on the program. And best of luck to you and your team at Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. Keep doing the great work you're doing, and hopefully in a year or two, I'll find myself not just visiting Canada, but even moving to Canada so I can help mobilize the movement.
All right.
Ciao till then.